Paglia.
Sorry.
No, thank you, Sarah. Thanks for capturing that. Elizabeth joined Historic New England in 2021 as the Preservation Services Manager for Northern New England. She oversees about 48 historic properties that are conserved throughout New England and works with private homeowners to conserve their properties. She also engages with the cultural history of these properties by researching the people who lived in these homes. She previously worked with historic properties in Scotland and holds a Master's of Science in Architectural Conservation from the University of Edinburgh and 2 BAs in Archaeology and Architectural Studies from Boston University. We're really grateful to have you here tonight, Elizabeth, and I will turn it over to you. And a note, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll have time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jess. I'm happy to be with you guys tonight. I will share my screen and we will jump in. All right, can everyone see my PowerPoint? I'm going to take no noise as a yes.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, thank you. All right, so everyone, good evening and welcome. I'm really excited to be with you tonight to talk about old house care and preservation do's and don'ts when it comes to historic homes. So as Jess said, my name is Elizabeth Paglia. I am the Preservation Services Manager for Northern New England at Historic New England, and I'm looking forward to diving in. So some of you may be familiar with Historic New England, and for some, this may be your first introduction to our organization. Historic New England is the oldest, largest, and most comprehensive regional heritage organization in the country. As part of its mission, Historic New England saves and shares historic homes, open spaces, collections and stories from the past to today. Perhaps you visited one of our 38 public historic sites around the region, such as the Gropius House in Lincoln, Massachusetts, Casey Farm down in Saunderson, Rhode Island, Castle Tucker in Wiscasset, Maine, or the Barrett House in New Ipswich, New Hampshire. We also care for a collection of well over 110,000 objects related to life in New England throughout history and house an archive of over 1 million items. We offer a wide variety of school and youth programs using historic resources, and through our work, we also hope to inspire good preservation practices beyond our site and across the region. Within the organization, I am part of the Preservation Services team, which builds partnerships between Historic New England and preservation-minded folks outside of our organization who share the goal of protecting historic properties throughout the region. And so we do that by mitigating change through legal protection and on-site consultation services for our 119 privately owned properties in our preservation easement program. We share technical guidance based on Historic New England's 112 years of practical preservation experience. We provide educational programs, talks, and field schools about what makes a building or a place worth preserving. And we strategically advocate for historic resources. So I'm with you tonight to talk a bit about preservation approaches to caring for old houses. So first we'll go over what it means to preserve a place and the different terminology that people use to talk about preservation work. We'll talk about how to look at an old house and start to understand how it may have changed over time. And I'll give you some guidance on how to successfully add to an old house and some other ideas for recapturing historic character. And then we'll finally end with some tips on improving energy efficiency in old homes. So all buildings evolve over time. Even if you live in a 17th century saltbox home, you probably have indoor plumbing and some sort of mechanical heating system. So then how do you identify appropriate treatment options? What to save and what can be altered? And what does it mean to preserve? Take the Lyman Estate in Waltham, Massachusetts, for example, seen here. Now, this is a house that has seen continuing modifications outside and in for over 225 years. So when I say that Historic New England is preserving this place, what does that mean? Historic preservation is a kind of philosophy about how to treat old buildings, and it's been defined in so many different ways by a variety of different people over the years. James Garvin, historian and author of A Building History of Northern New England, for example, establishes this preservation philosophy. Let the changes that you make to your property be additive rather than subtractive in nature. Try to make your work add to the legacy of the past so that you can pass a dwelling of even greater value and comfort to the future. Remember that the number of old houses is finite and diminishes each year. It is a privilege and a responsibility to own a piece of the past. Now, you can see this kind of additive approach that Garvin talks about here at Historic New England's Spencer Pierce Little Farm in Newbury, Massachusetts. Now, this is a 1690 brick house, seen on the right, that's been added onto with a 1790s Georgian addition on the left. The interiors are Victorian. Now, preservation professionals use the National Park Service standard. Now, this breaks the philosophy behind caring for an old building into four categories. You have preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Now, preservation is the act of applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of a historic property. So work, including preliminary measures to stabilize the property, generally focuses upon the ongoing maintenance and repair of historic materials and features rather than extensive replacement and new construction. New exterior additions are not within the scope of this treatment. However, the limited and sensitive upgrading of mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems and other code-required work to make properties functional is appropriate within a preservation project. Rehabilitation is the process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions, while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, or architectural values. Restoration is the act of accurately depicting the form or character of a property as it appeared at a particular period of time by means of the removal of features from other periods in its history and the reconstruction of missing features from that period. And then reconstruction is the wholesale recreation of a building or a feature that no longer exists. So it's more typical when working with a contractor, though, to use words like preservation, restoration, renovation, and remodeling. Now, preservation is the most conservative approach, and like the National Park Service standard, is generally reserved for museums. Restoration is similar to the National Park Service definition by removing later features to return it to something considered original. Renovation is most closely related to rehabilitation in National Park Service terms. So this is the adaptation of a building for modern needs. And then remodeling is a profit-driven approach that has little concern for historic integrity or significance. At Historic New England, decisions about caring for historic resources are driven by our preservation philosophy that we developed in 2009. Now, this set of guiding principles includes researching and documenting resources in order to make informed decisions about their preservation and adaptive reuse. We monitor historic resources to ensure that timely maintenance and repairs that are essential to their long-term preservation are done. We choose maintenance and repair treatments that prioritize keeping historic material and are reversible wherever possible, meaning that they can be removed without damaging the historic fabric. And then we ensure that those treatments also acknowledge and preserve the design and craftsmanship that created the historic resource. We share what we know with others, just like we're doing tonight. And we also learn from others by following and improving upon national best practices. So Historic New England's goals for our museum sites are different than those of the typical homeowner, but this philosophy provides a really solid baseline for museums and private properties alike to ensure that decisions are made with the longevity of the resource in mind. So let's take a look at a few examples to consider which philosophy has been employed. So take this house, for example. You see a historic image on the left and a modern photo on the right. Does this look like a preservation approach, which involves maintenance and repair of historic features? Is this renovation or rehabilitation, which adapts the property to modern needs while retaining its historic character? Or is this remodeling, which discards historic character in favor of standard commercial materials and methods. In this case, this is remodeling. This historic house has been sterilized through things like vinyl windows, a standard commercial entry porch, and historic fabric and character being lost, even though the house is still standing. So then how about this example? So this is also remodeling, not preservation, even though the house today on the right looks more quote unquote historic than it used to. If you compare the current image to the historic one, you can see the changes to windows at the front and at the L off the back. They've dropped the window sills to make them larger. There's a new door surround. There are corner pilasters on both front corners of the building. And there's a really big addition off the back that looks like a barn. So these are not historic features. There's no evidence that this house ever looked anything like this, but the decisions were based on aesthetic needs or desires. And then what about this case? So this is rehabilitation. This owner has opened up the historic porch at the upper left and enlarged an addition on the right to accommodate their needs, but they've clearly retained the historic character of the house. The truth is that most old houses are either rehabbed or remodeled. So here are a couple more examples of efforts that are trying to improve an old house and make it more interesting, but neither of them is preserving the character of that original structure. The house on the left has been badly remodeled, and the owners are trying to make it look more appealing through the addition of stock features. The house on the right is a mid-century ranch house that's been made to look like a craftsman bungalow. So then before you do make changes to a house, let's talk a little bit about how to look at an old home and how to start reading the changes that have already happened. So one common way that old houses have changed is by getting larger. For instance, at this house, you can see the expansion in the sheathing boards at the roof. The earlier house is the part under the vertical boards on the right. Later, the house was expanded past the front door to include the additional 4 windows on the left. So this is an 18th century rehab project. Porches and windows often update an older house, such as this colonial revival porch on an Italianate style house. But the 2/2 windows that you see could be original. Knowing that mansard roofs were easy to add helps you see the federal period house beneath. In this case, the owner chose to restore the house to its earlier Georgian configuration by removing the mansard roof, shutters, and entry porch that were added in the 19th century, and restoring it to its original 18th century profile. So just like in the past, owners today often want to expand their houses. Common issues with adding on to old houses include what we call radical remodeling. So it's easy to see how the addition on the left of this house went wrong. It doesn't respect the scale and vocabulary of the historic house, and it doesn't consider its massing and proportions either. These are really 2 completely distinct ideas jammed together and arguing with each other, and the new addition doesn't add anything to the compatible to the story that the old house is trying to tell. Another common issue is pushing the envelope. So here they've expanded the original Cape Cod style house in literally every direction. They've put dormers on the top, a porch on the front, extended the back, a garage on the left, and added an L on the right. We also see issues with split personalities in houses. So does the right hand know what the left hand is doing? When adding on, think small and simplify. So first, you just live with your new old house for a while before starting large construction projects. And keep additions within the allowable zoning envelope, designed so that you don't need a variance or other special permit. Look for a design that is compatible with the existing house in terms of massing, size, scale, and architectural features. A preservation goal is always to minimize the loss of historic fabric and minimize the changes to the primary facades. An addition should be clearly differentiated from the historic building. And preservationists also use the term subordinate. You don't want an addition to distract from the historic house or overwhelm it. A simple form with a lower ridgeline than the house, a smaller footprint, and keeping the wall planes of the addition set back from the wall planes of the house, or even connected via a hyphen, all help to accomplish this. The goal is a seamless addition to an old house based on the original house design. Material compatibility is also important, as is fenestration that is compatible in size, character, and rhythm to the original on the house. When it comes to building code compliance, historic buildings often receive special consideration, depending on the state and municipality in which you live. So it's worth reading the code or talking with the building inspector to find out. Don't assume that your historic building has to conform to the same code requirements as new construction. For example, don't assume that you must remove features for building code compliance. Porches like this one, that are less than 18 inches off grade, may not need railings. See if you can augment rather than replace for code compliance. For instance, to that porch, add an extra rail on the non-compliant porch. At this public library, handrails on the stair had to be a certain height. So rather than replace that railing, they were able to sensitively add a new handrail above the old. So you might have noticed that with some of these examples that paint is a great way to recapture historic character in an old house. This could be, and actually is, an entirely separate lecture, but as a general rule of thumb, for many New England houses, a 3-color paint scheme is the norm. You have one color for the body. The siding being applied in this image is dark gray. You have a second color for all of your sash, shutters, and doors, basically everything that moves. In this case, it looks to be either black or even a really dark red. And then the trim is this third color, which is literally everything else. So your window surrounds, your pediments, your cornices, your corner boards, your porch railings. If your house was sided with vinyl or aluminum at some point, removing it is another great way to recapture that historic character. So if you want an idea of what your house might look like without siding, look at similar styles of housing in your neighborhood. Seeing a well-preserved Italianate, such as at the upper right, helps you see what's been removed or altered in one that's been changed in the lower left. Old houses that have been sided generally retain their original clapboards or shingles beneath that newer siding. So evidence of original trim shows up where it's been removed. And the best source for what your house looked like originally is your house, minus the siding. Removing siding will likely expose some issues, however, that will need to be repaired. Installing aluminum or vinyl siding damages historic fabric when furring strips and siding components are nailed to the building. Siding is also sometimes applied by owners as a quick way of covering up underlying issues like a drainage problem at a roof. So the siding installation process also requires that the existing surface be really flat and free of obstructions so that the new siding will be smooth and even in appearance. And to achieve this requisite flat surface, details may have been removed or cut back. You can see that in this upper right photo here, where the profile of a historic wooden window hood remains in the paint. You can see in the lower image where shutters used to be installed and where they've uncovered a small door at the back addition. Many trim elements can be replaced with stock moldings or simple carpentry. Millwork companies often stock a wide variety of molding patterns and details that may match elements from your home or could be reasonable approximations of traditional trim. This includes moldings for porches, windows, doors, and roof lines. This raises an important question about substitute materials at historic houses, though. So synthetic alternatives exist and new options are appearing every day for every aspect of a building. You see vinyl windows and siding, permastone cladding, decorative architectural shingles. In most cases, we don't recommend replacing traditional materials with modern, no-maintenance alternatives. As a homeowner, we'd suggest you start, however, by weighing a few considerations about the existing resource. What is the significance of the building or feature? Is it on the main house or a small garden shed? What is the significance of the element? Is it a simple stair riser or a carved railing? Is the element prominent on the front facade or is it tucked into a back or side elevation? Is the original deteriorated beyond reasonable repair? And how much are we replacing? Then look at the substitute material. Will the synthetic material look and feel the same as the historic one in color, texture, sheen? And what about at installation versus when it's deteriorating or even just 3 years later? What maintenance is required? Must it be painted? Can it be painted? Can it be repaired? For instance, if your PVC fence gets damaged by a snowplow, you have to replace it. And then what is the cost to install, maintain, and replace the object? How do the life cycle costs compare to a traditional material? How will a synthetic material impact the surrounding historic fabric? Do we have specs on the product? Has it been around long enough? What about moisture penetration? Differing thermal expansion and contraction rates? Reversibility, and even weight. Cementitious siding, for instance, does not have an insignificant weight. Like I said, very often we find traditional materials to be superior to substitutes when we weigh all of those factors. One exception that we found, however, is with historic wood gutters. So because they're constantly exposed to weather and water, most wood gutters have been replaced more than once in their history on a building, and new wood just is not as durable as it used to be. Plus, the intensity of rainstorms in New England is increasing. When it rains, more water is coming down in shorter periods of time, which often overflows traditional wood gutter profiles. So when it comes to wood gutters, we actually frequently suggest that homeowners consider options for installing a copper or fiberglass gutter that replicates the historic profile, not the aluminum K-style gutter that you see at the far right, which is distinctly different. When viewed from the ground, these substitutes don't typically detract from the historic character of a house, and they may be significantly better in terms of drainage capacity and longevity. So then finally, let's talk for a moment about energy efficiency in older houses. So improving the efficiency of New England houses is not a new idea. Chopping wood, shoveling coal, this is hard work. So people have been pursuing ways to reduce their energy consumption for as long as houses were being built. Early New England homes faced south to take advantage of sunshine. Brick nogging, which you can see in the right image here, and eelgrass in the bottom left were used as insulating materials. Ceilings were kept low to keep heat closer to its occupants. Shutters kept door or hot sun out in the day or warm air in at night, depending on the season. In the 19th century, double-hung sash windows allowed for air circulation. You open the top and the bottom to create a convection current in the summer. Later, casement windows allowed for even more airflow. Likewise, radiators were positioned beneath windows to create convection airflow in the winter. Sash locks were used to keep windows tightly shut and to seal out drafts. Heavy drapes and rugs insulated, and doors could be closed to keep heat into specific areas. Porches shielded windows from high summer sun and also allowed people to live outside of warm houses in the summer months. So that being said, most old houses do have room for improvement in energy consumption. We're lucky because New England has a lot of these old houses. Between 19 and 32% of housing stock in New England was built prior to World War II. So it's really worth thinking about how we as a region can increase the efficiency of our old homes. Also, aside from any larger impacts, it could save you some money and could make you more comfortable in your house. Energy efficiency upgrades that get the most attention these days tend to be the most cutting edge and the most invasive. These are often marketed as deep energy retrofits. In preservation terms, deep energy retrofits involve subjecting older and potentially historic homes to an unwarranted and unjustified level of experimentation in terms of current level of expertise in 3 critical areas: the materials science, the building technology, and the construction trades. More costly, more complex, and less well-tested energy interventions, such as wrapping a house in several layers of rigid foam insulation and installing geothermal heating plants, are likely to be too expensive, too invasive, too prone to failure, or too complicated for the majority of our existing housing stock. The standard deep energy retrofit, which includes conditioning the entire interior volume of the structure from basement to attic, is a really complex, demanding, and intricate process that integrates meticulous air sealing, comprehensive control of moisture in the building envelope, and an active management of heating and ventilation systems. It presumes a really high level of expertise on the part of the designers and the installers of the systems being used, and it often includes a substantial loss of historic materials and finishes. While dramatic reductions in energy consumption can be achieved, these retrofits may have more moving parts than an old house can be expected to reasonably handle. They're designed with new construction in mind and are not a good fit with old houses that have moved, shifted, settled, sagged, and just generally been mucked around with many times already. So we need more information, really, about these. We need more research on the building materials side. We need a better understanding of historical methods and practices on the building technology side. And we need more training and specialized knowledge on the side of the building trades. Until then, the best advice on old houses is to keep energy interventions to a more basic level that respects the core principle of preservation, reversibility, and proceed slowly. If we can concentrate on enhancing these energy performances in newer houses, we will eventually develop the expertise needed to safely, successfully, effectively, and also economically implement those strategies in older and historic homes over time. So the good news is that does not mean there aren't plenty of things that can and should be done in any house, regardless of its age or historical significance, to make it less of an energy consumer. And they're likely to be less expensive and less stressful for you to implement as well. I like to think of this approach as taking the low-hanging fruit, or the shallow energy retrofit, if you will. That's what we did as a comprehensive energy retrofit of the Lyman Estate, which is owned by Historic New England in Waltham, Massachusetts, and I mentioned earlier. This house was designed in 1793 by Samuel McIntyre and has seen a variety of changes over time, especially in the late 1800s and around 1917. The Lyman Estate is not a museum, but is actively used for offices and as a functions rental. The shallow energy retrofit approach that Historic New England took was designed to be completely consistent with our preservation philosophy, including focusing on solutions that are reversible and minimally harmful to the architectural fabric of the house. This effort reduced energy consumption in the 14,000 square foot mansion by 47%, using all of the steps listed on the slide, including repairing and rehabilitating over 100 historic wood single glazed windows and adding weather stripping and new storm windows, and also converting the oil heating system to a high efficiency natural gas system. Our project began with a comprehensive energy audit of the building to identify areas to concentrate weatherization efforts. We also looked at how much oil we were using and how much electricity, so that we can have accurate figures to compare with our results. Historic wood windows are a better product than any replacement option that you'll find today because they're built to be repaired, so they can last and last. Wood windows do require maintenance, the occasional painting, reglazing, or sometimes some carpentry repairs or general tightenings up. But you can enhance their efficiency with weather stripping and storm windows. There are many studies that show that retaining a historic wood window and adding a good quality storm window gives equal energy efficiency to the double glazed replacements. Here is a thermal reading taken during the installation of good quality interior storm windows at the Lyman estate. One window in this photo has a storm installed and one does not. It's also worth noting that the cost benefit of repairing historic wood windows and adding storms versus the life cycle costs of replacing vinyl windows every 20 to 30 years is not insignificant. In the long run, repairing is cheaper and more sustainable than replacement. We also carefully insulated the conditioned space of the Lyman estate from the unconditioned third floor and attic, and we sealed gaps with a reversible foam product. For homeowners, insulating attic floors, using bats or rigid foam or blown-in cellulose are all good reversible options. Insulating your basement can be a little bit more complicated because the heating plant is often down there, as is the case at the Lyman estate, and there's generally also bigger moisture issues in basements. The most valuable area to insulate is at the sill or the rim joist, and then around any penetrations like utility connections or ducts. Whatever you may be told, know that introducing insulation into the walls of an old house is really complicated. Active older wiring and walls retrofitted with insulation can be a fire hazard, and there's also a lot of potential moisture issues. A former colleague of mine spotted this Greek revival house in Connecticut a number of years ago. Whenever wall insulation was added to this house, it is now harboring so much moisture that the entire framing structure of the house can be read in the mildew patterns on the outside walls. I know this is what preservationists fear. This is most likely a 1970s oil crisis insulation job run amok, and 40-something years later, the house is well on its way to ruin and certainly unlikely to be a healthy interior environment for its occupants. Poorly done wall insulation is also the culprit at these buildings, where paint is sheeting off walls that are insulated. These days, blown-in or dense pack wall insulation done properly does not have to result in these kinds of moisture problems, but managing moisture in houses where you're breathing, cooking, and showering is a complicated piece of building science. It's a lot easier to do when you have full access to the wall cavities, but for most historic houses, that involves removing all of the clapboards and sheathing or all of the plaster and woodwork. And at that point, you need to consider if it's worth it. Which brings me back to my earlier point. So it takes a long time to learn whether complicated building interventions will be successful in old houses. Increased energy efficiency is absolutely possible with older homes. Remember that we cut our energy use in half at the Lyman estate. But if you want to ensure that your house stands the test of time, these are the key principles to keep in mind. Treat old houses very gently. Focus more invasive interventions on newer houses. Stick with simpler and reversible interventions, and beware of over-complex solutions and one-size-fits-all or no-maintenance solutions that are too good to be true. I'll end my talk today with a final tip. When in doubt, seek help from others. Now, Historic New England is always happy to share our expertise on old house care. We have a number of resources also on our website, including a variety of white papers on maintenance topics. We also offer personal consultation over the phone or email through our homeowner services, which you can access as a benefit of premium membership with the organization. So if you're really scratching your head about a particular tricky situation at your home, definitely consider these options and reach out. And with that, thank you. I will stop sharing my screen. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them now.
Hi, Elizabeth. I have a question. Can you hear me?
I certainly can. Go ahead.
So it's interesting what you just said about the windows. You know, there are so many companies out there advertising on TV about Anderson windows. Will come and install those for you, and that you your research shows that the wooden windows with suitable storm windows can be just as efficient. I mean, that's very interesting.
It certainly is, and it's something that we feel is incredibly important to get out to more people who are investing in these vinyl windows, not necessarily having all the facts, right? And so they are touted as Anderson or Brosco or Pella. They all offer a variety of lines of windows of different types and qualities. But we found that over their lifespan, the cost of having to replace vinyl windows when they fail, and they always do fail, because the way that they are built is there's a vacuum chamber in between the two glass panes that is typically filled with an argon gas. And at some point that seal fails and your windows will start to fog up. And at that point, it's just air in between there. And that's just double glazing. And that is the exact same thing as basically having a storm window and your original window. And so at that point, those windows have to be replaced because they're not built. Modern windows are not built to be repaired the way that they're actually physically constructed. And so you have to replace them. Whereas historic wood windows can be repaired by a carpenter or a millwork company or a window company. So.
Okay, Elizabeth, we have one comment in the chat so far. We have a comment. The question reads, we air sealed our 1840s cape, and now we have too much moisture in the house. Any suggestions on how to handle moisture in an oversealed house?
Yeah, that is a tough one. Air sealing is great to a point, but we do see, for instance, sometimes contractors will air seal underneath clapboards, like underneath individual clapboards, and that stops the house from functioning as it was intended to. Which I like to think of houses almost as living beings. They need to breathe, and just like you need to breathe inside of them, they shouldn't be airtight. And so one of the options, if you know where your air sealing is if you did it yourself, finding ways in those most moisture prone environments to maybe undo a bit of that air sealing, if that's possible. Otherwise, there's very simple measures of opening a cellar window or using a dehumidifier in a basement or an attic. So those are ways. It's tough though when we're showering and we're cooking boiling water and just breathing in a house with multiple people to maintain that balance. It certainly is.
Elizabeth, you mentioned the energy audit. Is there a cost to having an energy audit done?
There, you can do, and at the Lyman Estate, we did have a private company audit because we wanted a very full, a really comprehensive audit. So in that photo on the slide where I talked about that, you saw this big red tarp kind of taped to an open door and then a blower fan installed in that. And that's a way to direct air in or out of a building and to identify its weak points or where air is escaping from that house. And so that's something that is a little bit more advanced in terms of an energy audit and would probably require a private company. But there are, at least in some of the New England states, and it's always on the ballot, so I can't tell actually immediately, having just gone through an election cycle, whether they've been renewed in all of the states. But I know, at least for instance, Massachusetts has an energy audit program. New Hampshire did or does as well, where the state runs one. So Jess or Sarah might be able to answer that question in Vermont.
Put a link into the chat.
Wonderful, thank you.
Oh, we have one hand up, D. Fisk.
Hi, this is David Fisk. I'm wondering what is considered an acceptable humidity level in an older house. And on the same subject, our house had a concrete foundation poured under it in probably the 1940s. And the foundation itself allows a lot of moisture to go through it, which adds to the humidity level. Do you have
Sure.
a recommendation for a way to seal that concrete?
So concrete is unfortunately really expensive to get rid of, right? Which would be kind of the ultimate way to do that. But we often recommend homeowners to put down a vapor barrier in a cellar if you are having problems with rising damp, if you will, coming up into the house from the concrete basement. And that's basically a rather thick piece of plastic that you put down and you weigh it down with, you can use bricks and make sure it goes up the walls at least 6 inches. And that literally just stops it from entering that house. It keeps it with the concrete, which can lead to deterioration of that concrete as well. But that's happening with moisture coming through it regardless. In terms of healthy levels of moisture inside a house, in our museums at least, we try to keep it between 30 and 70% of humidity, and of course those are typically spaces that are not being used by people daily or year round. So we're a bit more generous with that, but it's a good kind of ballpark range to think about. 90% humidity within a conditioned space is clearly something is amiss, unless you've just got your windows open all summer and it's just rained. So
Okay, I do have a couple more questions related to moisture. We have, you can see there, that's an old window, probably one of the original windows in this house. And it gets condensation and a little bit of frost on it in the winter. But the same thing happens with some windows we've had installed in the last 10 years too. So I think your point about the modern windows versus the old windows with storm windows on them is valid. So, well, that's my comment about the windows. Are there products I've read, excuse me, I've read about products that can be sprayed onto concrete that seal the pores in the concrete to block moisture movement through the concrete, and it's vapor that's moving through. I don't have bulk water moving through.
right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, so that I haven't worked with that specifically with concrete. I'll admit that in our portfolio and lexicon of architecture, concrete is definitely a minor material. We do have it, and you'll find by and large preservationists are starting to struggle with the preservation of concrete on a larger scale as some of our 1960s and 70s concrete buildings themselves start to age. And so what do we do with those? So it's definitely a question that's at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. I've also seen those sealants that you can spray onto concrete. I don't know how they're marketed for concrete, certainly. I don't know how they would interact or affect the surrounding material. Like that moisture will try to get into the house in some way, and so it might redirect the moisture in some other fashion. But it's possible that they would work and simply create a veneer on that concrete that would keep the moisture below it. We also see them sometimes used on bricks, chimneys, for instance, which we don't recommend because that creates a very hard exterior veneer for the brick. But when moisture gets in, either from inside the chimney or rain falling down or something like that, the brick behind starts to deteriorate, and you won't know until it's pretty far advanced because that sealant has kept the outside structurally sound. So it's a little bit different in a concrete floor, obviously. And if that concrete floor is not particularly dear, it may be worth investigating.
Okay. May I ask one more?
Just go for it.
Okay. We have a poured floor in our foundation, and I have a rubber membrane on part of it where I do a lot of mechanical stuff. And if I lift up the rubber membrane, there is liquid water on the underside of it. And I'm wondering if I install a plastic sheet such as you described, will that, I imagine there's going to be liquid water under the sheet accumulating. Yep. Will that end up accumulating to the extent that it flows somewhere and it has to be pumped out?
Ooh, it depends on how wet it really is happening. I would kind of maybe test that area that you are currently under that rubber mat and dry it. Put that mat back down and see how quickly that water is accumulating. Because if it is a rapid rate, then it is certainly possible that you will start having trickling water and need to kind of think about that with regards to whether you have a sump pump or a some sort of diversion tactic in your basement, at which point it might be worth looking into how the exterior drainage at your house is working, is functioning. Is there a French drain that's trying to divert water away from the foundation so it doesn't seep in as much? Or is there, these other, even plantings sometimes can help alleviate that versus a hard surface. So,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Chris from Mumford, do you have a question? It looks like you came off mute.
No.
Okay, we have two comments or questions in the
I'll wait
chat.
for this.
Raise your
Oh,
hand.
sorry, I'll do one in the chat and then I'll go to Sharon. John asked, should you do interior, exterior storm windows? Any thoughts?
Both are fantastic. Interior will get you a little bit better seal typically because they can be compression fit into the window surround. We tested both of them at Lyman. We have interior storm windows on some of our larger windows that well, we use plexiglass interior storms on windows that would be too large to functionally take out each season. We used really good exterior storm windows on some of our other more functional like office spaces that we could then roll up as you would a typical window in the summer. And really there's very small difference between the two of them, aside from, there's aesthetic reasons. So interior storms won't affect the exterior view of your house, but it also won't protect that historic window. So your windows will continue to deteriorate or weather as they will. An exterior storm will protect those windows a bit more, but can be sometimes a bit more of a pain to install if you install them seasonally, and also clearly do affect the exterior view of the house. So you can get ones that are very narrow in profile that are very, very blend seamlessly in. And there's a number of companies out there that make those. Indo Window is one of them for interior good compression fit storms. And I think they're based in Iowa, but you send them your dimensions and they basically send you your windows. So yeah, it's if you're looking for the absolute energy efficiency, interior are a little bit better for that fit. But both of them work just fine and just wonderfully.
Sharon, did you have a question?
Yeah, my husband Dave did.
So we have around a little after 1860s farmhouse in New Hampshire with a granite boulder foundation that
Stone, it's
is
not boulder.
granite stone and a dirt cellar with some crushed stone spread out over the top of it, a little bit of drainage
Some pump.
and with some pump. My concern would be that any sort of sealant over that would likely accumulate moisture. So we have a dehumidifier in the basement. Is there anything else that you would suggest?
So the dehumidifier is a great way to go. Certainly that's definitely a great to keep that ambient or that area as dry as possible. Is there, do you find that you're seeing moisture accumulate on your subflooring or on timber members in the basement, or does it just kind of feel a little bit damp down there? Is there?
It feels damp. There's no
Stone is sometimes wet.
there's
Yeah.
when it gets really cold, there can be a little frost on some of the cellar walls.
Yeah. No. Oh, okay. Well, it's certainly it's possible.
It's typical.
What I see more so is that the gray stone, when it's in the spring, when it rains, there's a little tiny bit of seepage through the walls on one side. And so that the stone, there's sections of the stone that are more black than gray because you can tell that they're damp. And we had the whole driveway dug up many years ago and landscaping fabric put down, and we had
Drainage pipes.
and a drainage pipe put in, and that seemed to help, but I'm not sure. I'm thinking that might be dirt may have seeped in there since then, because I don't think it's helping as much.
Yeah.
I'm not really wanting to dig up the whole driveway again,
Mhm.
but I don't know we're having some deterioration in one wall beside the driveway, below ground in the basement, that we can cement over that. But I don't,
Border.
but really we have to deal with the water that's coming, it's only a little bit of water, but it's enough to be watchful of. So I
Sure.
don't know what else to do.
Yeah, so there's, I mean, certainly if it sounds like you have a French drain, which is a buried pipe, basically with holes in it around the exterior of a building, that catches that water and directs it to a dry well or to someplace off-site, they can get clogged. And so making sure that those are kept free, that would typically it's underneath like a planting bed or a gravel surround so that water gets into it, but it doesn't always filter out that dirt. And so they can get clogged, and that could be part of the issue that's directing water then directly into your basement. I also would say that, like I said before, with a vapor barrier, that's something that can be employed in a variety of purposes and ways. But if drawing back that gravel on your basement floor, laying down that plastic sheet and putting the gravel back over it will keep the water in the ground. If you're seeing deterioration of timbers, for instance, one of the things.
Timbers are fine.
Timbers are fine. That's really good really good. For those of you who may see that in your own cellars, though, with for instance, your pillars that might be down there, or even a brick pillar can deteriorate, can start to kind of, it's delamination is what we see, little dust falling off everywhere. Is even removing the bottom section of those pillars, putting in a stone or concrete block even, and then placing a vapor barrier on top of that so that water cannot be drawn up into those framing members, can be really helpful if that's ever an issue. And then also if it's in a wall, if there's a specific portion of a wall, for instance, near your driveway, that you're seeing more deterioration, kind of check the framing, take the clapboards off maybe around that sill, and make sure that it's not seriously deteriorating those framing members. And you can also actually put a vapor barrier along that wood underneath the sheathing boards to protect it from water from getting in. So, and these are all reversible methods, right? You basically can staple them down or just weigh them down, but could help with that. And then otherwise, opening a cellar window when it's a dry day, even just to get that water a little bit out of there if the dehumidifier is not doing it. So.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Well, Elizabeth, we're pretty much at time. There's one more question in the chat about repointing old brick, but maybe we'll take that in the last few minutes. Do you want to share your email address? Do you mind if people reach out to you if they have additional questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I can put it in the chat if that works
Great.
for everyone.
Again, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. We appreciate your interest in old houses and doing what you can to preserve them. I want to thank Elizabeth, our speaker, for that wonderful presentation. Again, we'll stick around for a few minutes if there are any parting questions, but have a good night.
One question or comment that I might have is our house has some additions added to it that have a crawl space. So it's a dirt floor crawl space. And about 20 years ago or 18 years ago, we had a vapor barrier put in, heavy mill plastic vapor barrier, and they brought it up onto the wall, like 2 feet up the wall. And then they spray foamed around the inside of the wall and up in each of the joist cavities all the way around the outside. And it made a huge difference, both in terms of moisture in the crawl space and in the insulation of those two crawl space areas. They actually took the insulation out of the floor, removed it because the heat from the house heats the crawl space now, but the heat doesn't escape because it's sealed all the way around. It was a tremendous thing. It really helped in many ways.
So is did they put the spray foam insulation directly on the subfloor, kind of in between the joists, or did they spray it onto the vapor barrier after it was installed?
Both. So the vapor barrier came up the wall about 2 feet and just short of the joist bays. And then when they did the spray foam, they sort of sealed the plastic to the wall with the foam. So it's literally sealed all the way around. And then more spray foam into the joist base, sometimes 12 inches thick. And,
Wow,
and
that's
so,
thick.
so really, and the other thing is that it sealed all the holes. You know, when you were in the crawl space in daylight and you looked around the joists, you see little pinholes of light coming here and there and everywhere around. The spray foam sealed all of that, and it's very tight. It was a great thing.
It's a really, spray foam is a very good insulator. I would caution anyone kind of applying it today to, in that sort of example, for instance, in applying it directly to the vapor barrier is actually preferable, because one of the drawbacks with spray foam is it's not really reversible. It's really expensive to try to dig that stuff out. And so if you do have moisture issues, or for instance, a pipe burst or something that gets into that subflooring, you might not know about it. We have a lot of people ask about spray foaming their attic spaces, for instance, in between the rafters in an attic. And we have seen it happen, but we really recommend it, to staple a plastic barrier along your rafters if you are going to do it, and then spray foam along that. Because then if you want to or need to take it out, or if you have a roof leak, how would you ever know you have a roof leak? Because that spray foam is hiding it from you, and it does a little bit too good of a job sometimes, and results in some sort of deterioration. So I'm absolutely glad that it has worked for you, and it certainly has some really good qualities, but there are some pros and cons.
Yeah, you're very right, because we had one of the heat pipes that started leaking, and I found out where it was coming from, and then I had to take like a keyhole saw and cut, 10 inches of foam out of the way and around so I could get into where the pipe was, and then resolder it. And then I got a can of great stuff and filled up the hole that I had cut. But you're right, it was challenging to
Yeah.
get into there.
Yeah.
And if you're doing any work to put in new electrical wires, like take out the old stuff and put in new, spray foam is not your friend.
Yeah, it is a big process, certainly.
Do the electrical first before you put any spray foam on it.
Yeah, and it works in something like a crawl space a little bit better. A basement, it's a little bit challenging, because if you were to install one, because of all of your pipes and such that are down there, typically underneath the floor of the basement, but also if you have your heat plant down there, your boiler, your hot water heater, heat naturally rises, and so heat will come up from that basement into the rest of the house. And if you were to put insulation all over that basement ceiling, you're effectively stopping that heat from rising, which is, so it's, in crawl spaces where you don't have your heat down there, it can be a bit
Hey,
better.
Elizabeth, we have one more hand up. Maybe we'll take AJ's
Yeah.
question as the last one. Go ahead, AJ.
There we are. Hi. Yeah, so this is, I know the moisture is a major problem in houses, but I have an 1815 brick house that needs repointing. And it has some bad repointing, or, 1960s, 70s, various repointing done on it. But I would like to know, it's in Vermont, in the Connecticut River Valley, like what the mix should actually be, so that it looks like that it looks like, 18 stuff.
Yeah, so whenever repointing is done, you have to think about repointing like you would paint. It's a sacrificial layer. The way that brick houses are built is that the repointing, or that mortar in between the bricks, was a given that it would eventually deteriorate and would need to be repointed. And you want the mortar to deteriorate, because the alternative is that the brick deteriorates, and rebuilding a brick wall is a lot more difficult than repointing a brick wall. And so using a lime mortar, which is the traditional mortar, meaning it's made with lime, so calcium and some sort of sand or aggregate to bind it together, is the way to go, because that's softer than brick. And so you can point it by hand, and it will eventually, as water comes in and goes out, and salt and all of these sort of things, it will start to fall apart, or to fall away. And that's normal. It shouldn't happen every year. It shouldn't happen every 10 years. But every so many decades, it will need repointing. But that's okay. The alternative is oftentimes we've seen in the 60s and 70s cement mortar being used. And it was thought as a quick way. Even today, it's still sometimes used because it's hard and it's permanent and it's thought to be very good as a mortar. The unfortunate part of that is that if your mortar is harder than your brick, the water that's going to come into that brick, because if you put a brick in a pot of water, it will get wet, right? It does soak up water. And then the water needs to escape somehow. And it tries to escape through the most porous substance. And so if that's the mortar, that's why the mortar starts to fall away. But if it's the brick, then the bricks start deteriorating and you get something where if you look at a brick wall, you just see the pointing remain. And the brick is like, it's far into the wall. It starts crumbling and falling away. And that's not ideal because at that point you just have to replace bricks. And that's can be really difficult to do. So I'd recommend finding a mason who knows how to use lime mortar to repoint, and they can or they would scrape out any loose mortar and then repoint by hand.
So do they put any Portland cement in there or not?
Oftentimes they do, and that's typically okay. It's just a ratio that you have to kind of watch for and make sure it's not a cement mortar with lime. It's a lime mortar with a bit of cement, but it is really typical to find that these days.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, thanks again, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. Your email's in the chat if anyone wants to follow up with you afterwards, but we hope to have you up to the Upper Valley sometime in the future, maybe in the summer. And again, thank you for your time tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.